Hi, everybody. We'll just wait about one more minute while some of the others join us, and then we'll begin. Evie, now would have been a good time to test our Spotify waiting music room list. We'll save it for studio.
Would need a dedicated one.
That's right, for his lecture series too. Okay, it looks like everyone's in. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for a lecture from Oana Stănescu. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kyle Miller. I'm an associate professor here at Syracuse Architecture, and I'll be hosting the event. Let me also now mention that if you'd like to enable closed captioning, and I'm pasting this in the chat room now as well, you can simply click to the right of the closed caption button on the bottom of the screen and click show subtitles. I think if you're on a PC, you just have to simply click the button. And thank you to Jessica for providing captions. I'm very excited that Oana's here to share her work with us tonight. Oana's an architect and designer, originally from Romania, who now splits her time between New York and Berlin. Currently in Berlin, unless you've shifted since we spoke last week. Among other notable achievements, Oana was recently nominated for MoMA PS1 Young Architects Program, as well for participation in the Coachella Music Festival. Her projects include the Plus Pool, which I suspect many of you are aware of. We won't see that tonight, but we'll see other projects, as well as a wide range of collaborations with Nike, MoMA, Virgil Abloh, Storefront for Art and Architecture, Kanye West, and many more. What I particularly appreciate about Oana's approach to practice is her comfort. Hold on, I'm going to mute this person making noise. Is her comfort with the blurry boundaries between unique design disciplines and the thoughtfulness with which she addresses every design task, no matter the size or scale. From the design of small retail venues to large infrastructural interventions, Oana seemingly always prioritizes the body in space, and maybe more importantly, the body in relation to other bodies. I've always found her work very personal, engaging, and even empathetic. Equally important, Oana is one of a handful of individuals actively redesigning the role of the architect today. That's my claim, not hers. That's a lofty claim. Not as a singular visionary, but as a team member, one of many in temporary global collaborations that solidify when necessary, at a moment's notice and wherever needed. Together, the unique combination of her talent and humility is quite inspiring. And the work is not only visually striking, but also incredibly intelligent, and always contextually specific and responsive. So regarding the format of the event, I'll soon pass the microphone to Oana. And after her presentation, Professor Evie Diamantopoulou has kindly agreed to provide a response to the talk and perhaps ask the first questions. And afterward, we can open it up to questions from anyone else. So at that time, if you'd like to ask a question, you can simply use the raise hand function in the participants tab. Or if you're not comfortable asking the question aloud, you can type it in the chat room and I can ask the question for you. Okay, Oana, welcome. Thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Kyle. How am I going to live up to that now? Thanks for that.
Sorry.
But really, thank you. Thanks for having me. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Evie. It's exciting to be here. And you know, it's actually super strange to give a lecture in 2020, just because so many things are changing. And I know I personally am a bit wary about anyone who's a little bit too sure on their footing today more than ever. But that's why I'm also glad that I was asked to also talk about the practice side. So I'm actually, and the work behind the work. So I'm actually hoping that we can open it up to more of a conversation after. I'm glad in a way that this isn't a webinar format, because what happens in a webinar format, you're literally just talking to a blank screen for about an hour. And even afterwards, you're unable to take the questions directly or see someone's face. And that's really unfortunate. So anyway, I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you for your time. Time also has a very different dimension today, and it has very different value. And I'm grateful for you sharing your time with me today, tonight, wherever you are. So I'll start. I'll just share my screen. We'll do the typical, does this work? Can you see my screen? Hopefully you'll be able to. And there you go. I'm going to presume someone's going to flag me down if it doesn't work. So I'll start by talking about a few of my projects. And the first one actually is probably the oldest project that I've been working on, actually even from before the Plus Pool. It's what started actually initially as my thesis project in 2000, I'm dating myself, 2008, I'm going to say. It's 2008. The project itself is that strange structure, that bridge-like thing that you see over there in the back floating. This is a picture from my hometown in Romania, Reșița, Romania. It's the western part of Romania and Eastern Europe. And this was during communist year, during our dictator Ceausescu's reign, one of those public demonstrations. And my hometown was really an industrial center point. Rumor had it that the Paris Eiffel Tower used steel from this town, which is probably not true, but that's how communist propaganda works, and we like to believe that. So this structure that you see here, this was during the construction. This was in 63, 64 when it was built. And it used to be the industry and these kind of structures were hugely important and a matter of pride for the city. This is how it originally looked at the time, so in the 60s. And this is a more recent picture from the last 10 years. Quite a dramatic, not highly dramatic as we're used in other parts of the world maybe, but for our little town over there, it was quite a dramatic shift. For example, this little church that you maybe see over here, it actually was wheeled away out of the way in order to make room for the so-called towers. My parents live somewhere around here. So this funicular is a half-a kilometer long structure that floats at about 100 feet, so 30-something meters above the town. Along with communism, the industry died too, which means out of a town of 100,000 people, the large majority of the workforce ended up being jobless, as we're familiar in many places around the world meanwhile too. But you still had these kind of important structures being the backdrop of, just everyday life. This is the name of the hometown. So this is our little Hollywood sign. And you're always aware, this is basically the downtown and the kind of center of the town. And what happened with structures like that, of course, people started engaging with it in different ways. Here you can see kids running around that net or just climbing on it, doing more extreme things. And I too, during high school, would climb on it, partially because we do stupid things in high school, but partially also because it's a really powerful place. It's actually quite a unique place in terms of it gives you a perspective on the city that you wouldn't experience anywhere else. The downtown has some historic buildings, like that footbridge actually is over 200 years old, and some other buildings. But the basic premise is you have this intersection, you have these layered structures and this intersection of different worlds happening in this part of the town. So when it came time to do my thesis, I kind of was pushing the limits of what I thought I could get away with in school. And just thought, okay, if I kind of thought the expectation was to do something very architectural, but I just thought, can I just have fun and not do another museum or yet another project that I don't, feel much for, but can I instead actually deal with this thing that I've been playing on basically since high school. So this is images from my thesis proposal back in the day, which was really just to make it publicly safely accessible. It did pass as a thesis and I did graduate, thank God. These are some drone shots from from the way the current structure looks, to give you a sense for it. So fast forward to 2 years ago, I believe it was, the mayor of my hometown reached out. He called, actually he sent a Facebook message, which was strange to begin with, but he said, Oana, the city owns the funicular now. The city was able to buy it back, and he said, let's do something with it. It's a fairly small town, 100,000 people, with a not very, with a really difficult economy, essentially. So basically, we started working again. 10 years after the thesis project, we started developing the project. And what you see here is the city, and I'll maybe just replay these, but the city, as I mentioned, a city of 100,000 people is kind of in the valley between different hills, very green hills. It's a very lush natural landscape at the tail end of the Carpathians. And it's a through city, meaning people kind of drive through it in order to get to the mountains. Funnily enough, this was the image that made it out of the site visit with the mayor. This is the image that made the press. You can see it's Radio Romania on the lower right. And I thought this was hilarious because this was probably the very first site meeting I ever encountered where my client would not get on the site with me. So this is me, the mayor is on the lower right, and my partner, a former professor and a collaborator on this project, Bogdan Demetrescu, is on the lower left. And it's a tricky structure. It's right. You have a drop of 100 feet, no safety, and this thing is about not even 9 feet wide, and it goes on for half a kilometer. So in the end, I was the only one, together with one photographer, who ended up crossing the site. But what the project ended up being, it of course developed quite considerably from the thesis. But one thing that was important to us. Here you see just a part of the town. The funicular is in this part here over downtown. This is the half-kilometer long part. But in essence, it was really just, it's just a small part of a way longer trajectory. So what the funicular used to do, it used to carry stones from the quarry all the way to the factory. And what the main difference was, or how the project evolved over time, was our attempt was not to make the project just about the funicular, so just about the kind of bringing back to life this old structure, but instead use it as a way to reconnect the city, to stitch the city together. So on the one hand, if you are downtown, you have a direct access to the structure. You can bike through it, you can walk through it, you can spend time on it, you can go up there. But more importantly, it connects the hills. So the irony of this town is that although it's surrounded by nature, you don't have direct access to go for a walk, to walk your dog, to do anything. So basically the funicular in that sense just reconnects the city, and it allows you gives you direct access to the natural landscape, and more importantly connects different neighborhoods that didn't have a direct communication before, and connects those with surrounding trails that are either bike trails or hiking trails that take you all the way up to the mountains. So this allows you in a way to walk over the city and continue hiking to the neighboring mountains. What's strange, and I encountered that both at the thesis, but now too, is in dealing with something like this, is how do you draw something that's half a kilometer long? Like, what scale do you work at, and how do you represent it? This is the 2 plans and sections. So you can see it's actually quite difficult to tackle it, but you also see in the lower section that it's relative relationship to the city. So I'll just walk you through a few of the sections of the funicular. This is where you kind of start coming up from one of the hills and getting onto the funicular. And this is one of the sections. So basically the design was always intended to be super simple. This thing is incredibly present anywhere you are in the city. And it wasn't necessary to add anything to it. It's already there, the character is already there. So our interventions ended up being extremely minimal and in a similar design language as to what's already there, so that it feels almost like you found these places or these elements, these playgrounds almost, all over the city and just brought them back to the funicular. The top layer, this is the top plan, is one straight line. So that's for biking in the kind of fast lane. And below is more of a broken down meandering path that points towards different areas and creates different moments. And here you can see the section and the relative relationship between the two. This is the top. And when I meant that it was a very powerful place, this is what I mean. It gives you a perspective unlike any other in a town like this. And even, you know, we do have concerns that even with those handrails, it's still gonna feel a little bit uneasy, especially if anyone's afraid of heights. Some of the interventions that I mentioned are swings or benches, seating players. But there's also areas like this where we have a slide, which will actually be quite scary, I believe, because you're essentially getting in on a slide at 100 feet above the ground with no sense of where this ends. It's actually a fairly short slide, as you can see here, but I am really curious how that's gonna feel. Some of these other views show you some other moments. There's moments in which we try to make the net accessible, therefore you can hang out there all day, read, do whatever you want. Some of the swings. And funnily enough, one of the only requirements from the mayor was actually to have a bungee jumping. That makes sense in many ways because there's a lot of extreme sports happening in this part of the town or of the city, and it was intended as a way to kind of keep the people who pass through or who are doing sports, to kind of keep them engaged and give them a reason to also kind of keep coming back to this. The most exciting part about this is we just received confirmation 2 days ago that the European Union, we got funds approved from the European Union, and it's quite a significant budget. So the project is moving forward and we're just incredibly excited. And it has a little bit of a scary connotation. Like in my mind, it sounds, the notion of having your thesis become a real project within a decade. It has the kind of drama of a novel to me. So I find there's always a kind of strange self-fulfilling prophecy there, but we'll see how it goes. But so far it's been really amazing. And these last days, it was quite incredible, actually. Apparently not all things are terrible in 2020. One thing that I wanted to point out with this project, and if you're familiar with the Plus Pool is a water filtering floating swimming pool in the East River. If you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to look it up and find more out about it. But that also was started as an initiative between myself and 3 other friends, Dongping Wong, Archie Lee Coates, and Jeffrey Franklin. And in both, I'm mentioning that because in both of these cases, something happened inadvertently. In the case of the thesis project, I never imagined it would come to fruition quite in this way. The premise was simple. It's more expensive to take the structure down than to make it accessible, safely accessible. So, but both in that premise and in the premise of the Plus Pool, where we also just had the idea of the swimming, floating, water filtering pool, we basically inverted the typical design process. So if a typical design process starts with a policy that's in place and a client getting together his funding, probably buying a site and then starting to engage a team, the design kind of coming about at the later stages. In both of these projects, we flipped the process upside down. So it actually started from the design, which more often than not, it was really, in both of these cases, was inspired really by the public or by the public experience of the cities. And it was the design that actually enabled us putting a team together and finding funding, and ultimately, hopefully also allowing us to change policy and come back. So I thought this was just an interesting discovery. I'm saying it was, I don't know if accident is the right way of putting it. None of us, I think, would have dreamt, not in the case of the Plus Pool or the funicular, that these projects would have the life that they did. But I do think our job as architects at times is also to just point towards imagined future, towards possible futures, and work outside of the spectrum of just what's possible on the one hand. But on the other hand, it's also just about doing things without being asked to, or without waiting for someone to kind of knock at your door. We always say with a pool, if we were to wait for someone to ask us to do the world's first water filtering floating pool, which is a mouthful, it would have been a long wait, and possibly wouldn't have happened. But maybe more importantly, actually, the thing that I keep thinking about, can this process be actually more circular? Can it be more continuous? Can these things not be separate? And how do we make sure that these boundaries are more blurry and that there is a constant feedback loop, that the public isn't at the receiving end of a really long and painful process, but that there is a constant just ecosystem almost between when it comes to the process of designing public spaces. Another public project, which Karen mentioned earlier, was a proposal for the Young Architects Program competition at MoMA PS1 2019, feels like decades ago. What we decided to do is we decided to take the notion of fun very seriously and commit to it. And at the time, basically so maybe if you're not familiar with MoMA PS1 since this summer, it didn't happen. There's the warm-up series happening every summer where every Saturday and or Sunday, I think it's Friday, Saturday, or just Saturday, there's a huge party in the courtyard of MoMA PS1. And to me, it's one of those ongoing traditions of New York. It's where you go and you realize your generation has passed, because you always see the kind of the spirit of youth and just the spirit of New York at its most exciting. And it reflects in a way the spirit of the institution too. And so the project asked for an installation in this courtyard. And at this particular moment, I started seeing basically projects or architecture as an opportunity to spend time with people I admire. So I asked my friend, at the time we weren't even as close, but my friend Akane Moriyama, this is one of her installations. I asked her if she wanted to work with me on this project, and she said yes. She's a Japanese, Swedish / Portuguese architect / artist, textile artist. But she's really amazing. So we got together and we started working on this project. And one thing that was really important to me, to both of us actually from the beginning, it was very difficult because we came from different sort of mindsets, right? She's an artist and thinks in very specific terms. Me as an architect, I tend to think way more functionally or program oriented. But the one thing that we could agree on, we thought there's so much noise in the world, there's so much disagreement and just noise altogether, that we wanted to create something that hits a little bit deeper, that kind of allows people to let their guard down, be a little bit more vulnerable, and allow people to interact or communicate or meet at a different level, one that's more visceral and maybe less direct. So that was one thing. The other thing where we also agreed completely was that we were going to work with the budget, not against it. It's a known fact that the budget is quite limited considering that's a huge surface area. But to me, that's an exciting premise for any project, really, because it forces you it gives you certain constraints and it forces you to think in certain ways. So what the project is, working with the existing structure. If you're familiar with the courtyards, it's surrounded by these concrete walls with holes in them. So what we wanted to do, we proposed basically a large-scale cubic textile grid that's suspended from these concrete walls. And off the grid, they were hanging these so-called mobiles that were inviting interaction and play. This is the model. So these are, you can see those are existing holes in the wall. The structure is supported, these fabric clouds were supported with steel cables. Very straightforward. So the point of these mobiles were that one engages with them and thus creating ripples in the cloud and allowing people to communicate through that. The moment you create a ripple somewhere, another ripple comes from somewhere else. We thought that there's a serendipity to that, an unexpected element, but also a bit of a suspension of the normal social life. And again, allowing people to just intersect, communicate in a different way. We looked a lot at informal ways of play. This is the jiggle rail, I believe it was called, if I'm not mistaken, or just really other forms of play that are not prescriptive, and decided on very simple forms that are not suggesting any particular use, but again, invite interaction. You know, is it for 1 or 2 or 3 people? Do you sit, do you climb, do you jump on it? everything was possible. And this was done in mind with the idea that this is for a giant party with really amazing music. So one could truly have fun with it. The other thing that we really liked about that I thought was interesting about this was because we were working with very thin fabric, very powerful color. Each of the courtyard had two colors, two shades, yellow and blue in the case of the small courtyard, and yellow and red in the case of the large courtyard. But because it's fabric and because it's so thin, it's incredibly responsive to its medium, meaning depending on weather, depending on humidity, on the light, on your movement, on all the other people in the courtyard, the perception of this cloud of fabric would never be twice the same. So in this particular case, you see two images of the same courtyard. It's the model shot. It's two images from just different perspectives, and just the colors and the hues are radically different. If it looks greener at the top, blue on the bottom. This is the large courtyard in different sun conditions, on a cloudy day on the left side, on a sunny day on the right side. And again, the smaller courtyard with different perspectives. There was a whole learning curve about working with fabric and how unusual that was for me as an architect, and that was really exciting. We also did this was a 1:2 mock-up, that's Akane holding it. And this mock-up, for example, these just had, I think it was 9 cubes, if I'm not mistaken, so 9 squares essentially, and just 2 colors, so orange and yellow, or red and yellow. And you can see the incredible number of shades. I would have never guessed, if I wouldn't have known, that this would have had only, made up of 2 colors. And we thought that was really part of its charm. So more shots of this, of the mock-up. We had an incredible team that we were very grateful for working on with us. And this was the final shot. So it was very exciting from many different perspectives. On the one hand, working with Akane, learning to work with fabric, but also trying to think of architecture as something that is, never twice the same, that keeps evolving, but is also more of an incentive for people to engage with, and allowing people to meet at a more visceral level. Below is a quote that says, "The fun of play resists all logical interpretation," and really that's what we were trying to go against all reason, and instead just instigate people. Another project, trying to go at various scales and just different kind of extremes maybe of my practice. This is the Longhouse, in that sense probably one of the more traditional or typically architectural projects. Not all my projects are long, but this is really long, not half a kilometer long, but for a house it's pretty long. So this is an existing site in Canada, an incredibly pristine setting. It's a natural reservation with very limited area where one can build. The landscape is truly incredible, and that's an existing house on site that the current owner bought. It's a really funny house, and when I say funny, I mean it. This is the handrail inside the house. I'm just gonna skip. So that's from the previous owner, just to be clear, not the current owner. But we were, I was asked, and I invited my good friend and colleague Keith Burns to work with me on this project. And we're really grateful because it's for a family, of a very young family of 4, 2 plus a dog, so 5 technically. 2 young kids and a really lovely couple. And in a way, it's just incredible to have worked with them and to see a project like this kind of evolve with the intimacy of a family, and essentially just enable them to imagine or create a future here. So as I mentioned, the areas in which we could build were actually fairly limited. So you can see here, this existing house is the main site where one is allowed to build because there's something there already. And this one spans over a hill. So there's this ridge line here, which defines our border for where we can build anything. So this is the ridge line. So what we wanted to do, the ridge line goes east-west, which means what we wanted to do, we wanted to just take advantage, we on the one hand had to, but on the other hand, we also wanted to take advantage of the ridgeline and make sure that the house is very democratic in its approach, reflecting in a way the family and their way of looking at and their values maybe. What I mean by that is we wanted to make sure that all spaces do have access to both the north side and the south side. So if you are looking for the sun, you can find it and you can have that perspective, but you can also get the kind of northern, really clear light if you want it. So we embraced this notion of the ridge and then added a wall, which its main purpose is, well, it plays multiple purpose. But what we thought is the landscape is so incredible and it's a 360 view and you see no other built structure. So in a setting like this, you sometimes can forget to see things or it's maybe hard to see very specific moments. So what we use this wall for is really as a way to frame very specific moments throughout the entire landscape. In addition, the wall has infrastructural role. It holds both structure and MEP, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, but it's also has a thermal role. It kind of absorbs the heat from the southern side and releases it towards the northern side. And then we applied the module over that entire structure, allowing us to play and kind of shuffle and reshuffle all the different areas of the house. I know I saw Mac earlier in the audience. Mac worked on this, so he knows what I'm talking about. This is just a quick diagram showing the wall and some of the additional functions that it was holding and how we try to take advantage of it. This was one of the very early concept models that I think explains the best, in best terms, the kind of concept and the idea behind the house. That of a very simple wall that helps you frame and kind of see the landscape around you, both for big and small. It's a very long house, as I mentioned, so long that even when we put it on a sheet, we can't have the plan together. So this is the plan kind of section in two, or like these two sides are supposed to be in one long line, but we had to kind of cut it down just for reference. This is how it looks in its true length at the top floor. Very simple, with living areas on the left side. So living room, kitchen, dining area, open pool and deck area, and then the sleeping quarters and guest quarters on the right side. What's really nice about working on a project like this, it's fairly small in scale compared to a half-a kilometer long thing. And it really allows you to go really in depth with regards to the materiality, but also the specificity of every single corner. And it's really powerful because you are designing for a family, for individuals with a very specific way of living. And so what you see here is just a sequence of all the models. Actually, the smallest in the front, that's the most recent, but the one behind this one was the very first concept model that we put on the table, and the one where you saw the rendering from, which was followed by this second model with a light, maybe pink wall, in which we started exploring. You can see there's already dramatic change. We went up in scale during schematic design, and then up in scale again in the far back. That's for during design development. And that's just a third of that model because it was too long to fit in that photo. And then we came all the way down to the 3D printed version, which is up front here, which also just shows the concept quite clearly. Some of the in progress work at the time, it shows you how we're trying to engage the wall and kind of the overall structure of the house, where at times it frames the view, but also defines certain areas. Like in this particular case, there's a dining table that's part of that wall. And other times it really also enables different forms of privacy and togetherness. So one can be both together and be a little bit removed from everyone else, both throughout the length of the house, but also across. And at the same time, there's an interplay between the wall between the inside and outside. This in the pool area, for example, the wall is on the inside on the one hand, but outside at the pool, of course. But then also at the extremity, so the end parts of the wall also come outside of the structure. And just quickly, these are the elevations. These are the long elevations, and this is the short cross section to scale. So now what I'd like to do actually is, because I was asked to also talk about practice, I want to talk about one project that actually does not require any visuals. So what I'll do is, you know, I'll try to take you on a bit of a walk with me, if you can indulge me. And I'll play a video. And so one disclaimer, the video has nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about. I don't know about you, but I think we're all pretty zoomed out, just staring at screens for ages. I don't think it does us very good. So you're welcome to look at it. It might be choppy during Zoom. Because of that, Kyle is also going to put the link in chat if you want to look at the higher res version. But it's really just a walk through the woods. And that's partially because that's where I tend to think about these things, but it's also just a bit of a distraction. So you're welcome to look at it, but you don't have to. Really, I'd much rather just you listen, or that, yeah, basically just listen, as I'll just be talking through the rest of the lecture. I think in part too, because I found in this last period that I enjoy phone calls a lot more than I do Zooms, partially because there's a quality to the voice that the screen flattens. There's an aspect and an intimacy that the screen can't quite convey. So anyway, I'll let this play, but yeah, feel free to do whatever you feel like doing, or looking at whatever you feel like looking. So okay, the following project is a project that I always fail to represent. You know, whenever I try to do models or drawings or all the usual tools, it never quite worked. So for every meeting with consultants or people where I try to explain the project, I'd find myself just telling stories. So last year around this time, I was invited by Badlands, by a magazine for Balkanic culture, to contribute. I thought, okay, let's not illustrate the project, or let's try to illustrate it differently. Can we illustrate it through words? So what I will do now is I will read the project to you. Back in high school, I had a baby lion. The first night we got her home, we put her to sleep in a box filled with warm bottles and blankets right next to my bed. She was 4 days old, eyes still closed, belly so huge that she could barely walk. Her brother hadn't made it through the first cold night and their mom rejected them, but she was strong. I woke up in the middle of the night to find her on my chest. I assumed it was hunger that made her climb on me, so I went to heat up milk. But she didn't care for that. All she wanted was to lay on me, to hear the beat of a heart, the soothing rhythm of my chest, moving up and down. You enter a dimly lit, pitch-black gallery and are invited to lie down on the floor. I had been running only a few hundred meters, but the road was too hard, too long, too straight. As I entered the woods, I stopped, distracted by a sound, some faint electronic music and even rhythm permeating the forest. I tried to determine the source and realized in horror it was closer than I thought. It was my heart in overdrive, beating so fast I was no longer sure if it was inside my body. When your lungs are amputated, the rest of your body doesn't know. Lungs don't grow back, and the heart needs to make up for their absence. Your oxygen intake is cut in half. It could be a metaphor searching on the outside when the truth is within. If only I could make sure the heart wasn't going to break out of my chest. The lights are turned off. The sound of a deep breath is filling the room. The floor gently lifts you up. I rest my head heavy on his chest. If I look carefully, I can see the pulse of his heartbeat in a few places, at the base of his neck or at his wrist. It goes fast, incessant, tireless. The movement of the lungs layers on top, slow and calm. It will never match the heart, but seems to ground it like minutes making sense of seconds, the bass to the drum. Human heart rates and breathing patterns synchronize to other humans. We don't know why, but we regulate each other's energy by it. If you and I were in the same room, our hearts too might jump to beat in the same rhythm. Our lungs might start to breathe in the same breath. If I am missing him, it's my body missing his body and the ability to balance itself out. Talk about crawling under one's skin. With the sound of a deep, loud sigh, the floor gently goes down. You are sinking deep into a soft, soft ground. I always wanted to listen to Glenn Gould's Goldberg variations without the actual variations. The sound of his hum when the music pauses, his punctuation through breathing, should be its own record. He said he was involuntary and wouldn't do it if he had a choice, but feared the restraint would keep him from actually playing the piano. Now that, where he took that pause, that's absolutely Glenn at his freest. The purest form of bliss, the body liberated from consciousness. Seiji Ozawa thinks the perfectly timed empty spaces is when we're completely in Gould's world. His inner rhythms must be terrifically strong. Bach's Goldberg variation starts streaming through the speakers. The floor is moving gently to Glenn Gould's breath, which can sometimes be heard between the instruments. I used to have 2 transparent tubes coming out of my abdomen, the place formerly inhabited by 2 lung lobes, now an empty territory, a vacuum really, the result of the best kind of lung cancer. They were full of raspberry-colored liquid, the desired hue in technical terms, with a messy stitch in black yarn keeping them from slipping away from the open skin. With every deep breath, the air would whistle through the cut flesh. "You need more fat here," the doctor would say. The border between inside and outside had been breached, and every breath was making the liquid bounce back and forth, one's basic mechanics explicitly on display. When they took the tubes out, they also took the fentanyl. The bigger problem with the lung in agony, though, is not that of pain per se, but that all pain coping mechanisms are relying on its functioning. Screaming, crying, hyperventilating, holding your breath, hysterical laughter, anything really. 30-something years on this planet, and even the most basic lessons in survival feel rendered useless. Turns out that breathing is all there is. It's all we are. How does the obvious always escape me? The floor, soft and quiet, is breathing, taking you up and up and down and up and down and up and down. When I reached the clearing, an eagle was teaching her baby how to dive. She was going headfirst, vertically towards the ground, only to curve back up right before the treetops. The little one would imitate behind, graceless and full of thrill. If I had my way, I'd take you to the woods, my woods, at the tail end of the Carpathians. I'm never lonely here like I'm in the woods of North America or Europe, always lonely. It is where time is yet to be measured and life and death are not opposite ends but equal parts of eternity. We'd name all the trees and they would teach us how to see. We'd listen to our heartbeat, like Yoko said, and remember how to feel in the dark with our fingertips. The deer will teach us how to play, and if we stay long enough, we might learn how to fly too. This is the only place we need to live. This is the only air lungs want to breathe. Deep breath in, everything is moving up. Slow exhale, everything is moving down. When your body has to start from scratch, what's left is truly all you need. Art and some air, a tree and some love. Never before did beauty feel so crucial to survival, never before disobedience so integral to it. If I had my way, we'd burn down all mausoleums for stuffed palaces of storage and replace them with leaders and trees. We'd claim every corner of public space and call it a dance floor. We'd move into Borges' library and bathe in public fountains. The subway would be a Louvre commuting through layered histories. The first stop, the place for public weeping, followed by the station of sorrow. We'd maybe find hope further down the road. We'd rethrone life in all its absurdity and chase accidents. But mostly, we'd just breathe. Isn't that enough? Listen to your heartbeat, catch your breath. So I'm not sure the extent to which this did come through or not, but basically it's an experiment, but it's basically an installation in which the floor of a gallery is replicating the movement of lungs, allowing one to lie down, really not unlike the baby lion was lying on my chest, and just riding the movement and seeing what happens from it. I also wanted to avoid showing more projects and images for 2 reasons, essentially. On the one hand, I know that I'm zoomed out as you might be. But on the other hand, and as I mentioned, we're also constantly ambushed by images. And particularly when it comes to architecture, which is a spatial endeavor, we tend to really judge and think about things and consider really just 2-dimensional representations. So sometimes basically I'm wondering if breaking with that, if avoiding that way of looking at architecture allows us to find a different way into architecture. Some of the less visual work, if I may call it that, is for me is happening through school. And I am always a little bit uncomfortable with the term of teaching, partially because I see myself more on the learning side. And because I see myself as a peer with the students, the one difference is I have probably more experience in some of them, but experience when it comes to design is not always an advantage, as it can become quite quickly a straitjacket. So some of the things that we've been working on have been, for example, housing in a post-work society. Funnily enough, or not so funny, this happened in the last semester. So halfway through, we were sent home and lived in a post-work society. The studio was called Post-Work, Work, 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 Work. And if you go on that.org, you can actually see some of the work. The question was, in a post-work society, if you don't live somewhere because of its proximity to work, where do you live, who with, and how do you live? Another thing is called non-professional practice, where we're basically talking with people from different fields, curators, writers, architects, ex-architects, artists, so on and so forth, and people from creative fields, and trying to learn from their path. If you go to nonprofessional.org, you can also see some of that work, but maybe more importantly, in this issue of Volume magazine, which I believe is printed as we're speaking, you're going to find an interesting postcard exchange between some of these people. Were about 16 people, I believe. They were part of these conversations over the years that speak to the issue. And I'm always reluctant to kind of summarize too much things from non-professional practice. But the one thing that I think became clear is that besides the unpredictability of all these paths, it's that the intimacy of creative jobs rarely unfold in neat, very specific boxes, but really have more to do with climbing over, under, around, or through these kind of walls that we so often encounter. And then most recently, we started working together with the Stanford Law Design Lab, together with Nora Al-Haider, and in collaboration with Virgil Abloh. We're working on aspects of the justice system, meaning working together with state courts throughout the US, and working on specific design issues that are arising due to the pandemic. The insane thing about it is, the justice system has never undergone a dramatic kind of design or rethinking, restructuring, but the forced and improvised digitization that happened because of the lockdown is forcing a change. And the question is if we want to be part of the conversation or change or not. Honestly, it's incredibly hard. It's depressing, but it's also necessary. And in the same time, it's also, we're finding quite a bit of optimism in there too. It's still at the beginning, but hopefully we'll see where that goes. We're planning to having a more public showcase. But all of this to say that if I had to talk about practice, is that for me, architecture is the background, the sort of infrastructure, a sort of backdrop that enables for life to happen. And practicing architecture, I realized that for me is really just a way of making sense of the world, of myself, of everyone and everything around me. And because of that, I see as my main job or my main goal, really just putting assumptions constantly on fire, both mine and everyone else's. So I was listening to a lecture by John Cage the other day, and he said something that really stayed with me. It was a performance more than a lecture, of course. But he said one thing that stayed with me. He said, we can close ourselves off from experience through our likes and dislikes, or we can change our likes and dislikes by being more open to the world around us. And I think that really summarizes in a really powerful way what's important to me, and the reason why my work isn't about one specific thing or a particular, let's say, aesthetic or similar interest, but it really comes back to this kind of questioning. So that's to say that from where I stand, the nature of a project, the outcome, the process, my role in it are really completely open. And I see it rather as a live, organic, very fluid process or very fluid things. it probably helps that I always had a very healthy disregard for authority. I think it comes from seeing the dictator that was kind of celebrated one day being shot almost live on TV the next day. You realize quite quickly authority isn't what they make of it. But also because I never quite understood, to be honest, the relevancy of other people's opinion. Because I do think as a creative, to a certain degree, when you know, you know. And so what it means is it means, you know, I became, after 5-6 years, I became pretty quickly aware that I wasn't interested in a traditional office structure, that instead I prefer working with collaborators and just finding a more fluid way of operating in the architecture world. So a few years ago, and I'll stop in a minute, but a few years ago, I had to be put under for a minor operation of bronchoscopy. And I don't know if you've ever went through this experience, but essentially, you know, they put that thing on your face and then it kind of, the film kind of is being interrupted. So next thing I know, I just open my eyes, I see the nurse, I see the doctor. And I ask, I'm feeling things, is that okay? And they're laughing of me, of course, because luckily the procedure was over and all was fine. But really, I find the subconscious sometimes knows more than the conscious side of you. And the question really stayed for me. In that particular case, the subconscious was really just disassociating and trying to help me, try to convey the information as directly as possible in order to know what the reaction should be. But I think this question, I really, you know, it's seemingly rhetorical, but I can tell you it stayed with me ever since, particularly this year, particularly during the roller coaster of the lockdown, past, present, probably future. But I think it also speaks to, you know, working in gray zones, working outside of comfort zones, and always just pushing the boundaries of these kind of comfort zones. So my doctor's answer was, not only is it okay, but it's essential. So maybe this is a good place to stop now that Perry is doing his second round. And if you're still with me, I'd love to open this up to a conversation.
We're all still here. Thanks, Oana. That was really great. As promised, I'll pass it to Evie to have the first word. Maybe ask a question. We'll see where that takes us. At some point, we'll open it up to questions from everybody else. And as I mentioned earlier, you can use the raise hand function. You could even begin to type questions in the chat room now, and I can call on you when the time comes.
Thanks, Oana. That was really a lot to take in, and it's amazing how kind of the Zoom format has made us both like be that far apart, but also be a lot more personal through the comfort of our own homes and kind of the whole school in our screens. Yeah, I feel like I need a minute to come back from sort of the written piece and kind of going on a trip with you quite literally in this medium. So I guess I'll start with a very quick question. So how does one set boundaries? How do you set boundaries between life and work? If anything is a project up for grabs and sort of your idea of architecture is always this sponge that no matter what life throws at you, whether, you know, aging infrastructure or a tough disease, it becomes a project. Like, what doesn't become a project? How do you separate the two? How do you sleep at night? Like, very openly.
No, I mean, it's a good question, but I think what happens for me, I mean, the push and goes both ways, right, between quote unquote life and work, but I think the blurring of the boundary is really more so that there isn't a stark distinction, or they're not, or let me put it differently, they're not polar opposites, meaning it's not so much working 24/7 and work infringing on life, but if anything is life taking over work. So can you rethink what you do as work or as project so that it doesn't feel like you're doing work, but something else? And I realized that in having conversations with people, you know, one of my closest friends here, she's also an architect. We work from the same office. We're sharing a space. we never talk about work, and we hang out all the time, but never directly about the project. We actually have no idea what the other one is working on, but we talk indirectly about work, if that makes sense, or about different things. So that's how I tend to think about things, is how much can you get away with in terms of calling work, in terms of putting the things that you really enjoy, whether it's reading a book or whether it's writing or whether it's listening to an album. On my end, it was definitely listening to way too much Fiona Apple before doing this lecture. It's more about how can you rethink that notion of the work? How can you just grab more of the stuff that you enjoy doing, that you're passionate about, and turn that into something?
There's a lot of blinking here. I have one more question for you along the same lines as to trying to process everything. And I should probably start with saying I really admire the way you practice. I find it truly inspiring and motivating. What in particular I kind of really appreciate is the episodic nature of the projects themselves, that each project is a deep dive, but also a little bit of an island, you know, that you go in deep. And many of us have been taught, like, you know, old school, coming also from a European or a sort of non-American pedagogy. If you figure something out, just keep going at it. You know, if you come across this one project of aging infrastructure, then that's your sort of project for the rest of your life. It's aging infrastructure. If you begin a nonprofit, then that's your project for the rest of your life. And I think what you're doing and being unstoppable and doing it all at once and switching domains, and you know, you start to look at fun and that's it. It ends with PS1, or you look at fabric, but you don't return to it. It feels like you really kind of dive in, enjoy the project, and then you begin over with a new narrative and a new project, which in a way is the most anti-capitalist way to practice, right? Because you're not capitalizing on any given expertise, but rather each time you start anew and you have to reteach yourself, what is this new material? What is this new context? What is my new narrative? Which, you know, I was thinking a lot about, especially talking about sort of the collapse of communism at a formative moment in time.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah. How do you moderate obsession, maybe, is the question at hand. How do you stop looking at something after having taken a deep dive?
Well, while they seem very different projects, or like while they're different from certain perspectives, to me, I see the underlying DNA or connection point, which is more about, I think, a certain spirit or a certain set of values or a certain attitude more than anything else. It's just that they're not defined through size or aesthetics or any kind of the traditional boxes. And I think this has a lot to do with my upbringing, because when you grow up in Romania, you're basically, or during communism, you were given a job for life, maybe sent across the country, and that's it. You didn't have any options or anything. So you kind of grow up seeing your parents in that system. And I think I just had an out-of-body or allergic reaction to it. If you know how oftentimes when you grow up, you're kind of fighting exactly that. So for me, I think then it became a kind of, the moment I started discovering the rest of the world and working throughout the world and being put in this position of extreme privilege from many perspectives, I said, well, if I am in this position, I need to make the most of it. I can't, it's a little bit like, in a way, I'm not risk averse at all, partially because I feel if you made it this far, you might as well just make the most of it. So this notion of kind of just playing it safe, when you see, because of my background, I kind of see the unlimited possibilities of this world that we live in. It's impossible in a way, or it seems counterproductive for me to just limit what I do to one specific definition who is not mine. I think that's the key part. And I think it has to do again with you know, I didn't study in the States. I just studied in Romania. And then my second way of getting an education was by working at offices throughout the world. And I was extremely lucky through the offices in which I worked. And that was my second education. But then I also realized every office is doing architecture differently. And they're all equally valid. So there's no single way of doing things. And to me, that's the most exciting thing about architecture. It's not one thing. It can be anything. So then why limit or define? I mean, I think in a way that's a decision that everyone has to do, but it's a decision that has to happen consciously. And that's always important to me. I don't know if that answers it.
Yeah, no, and that's such a valuable lesson for everyone here today, you know, to be in architecture school and the knowledge that there are more than one ways for each and everyone here to perform once they graduate. That it's not just about what you design, but how you actually carve your career path in ways that are interesting and unique to you. I think Kyle would agree. I see you unmuting.
Is that your call to have me pick up? I do agree, of course. And I wanted to actually ask a question not entirely unrelated to that, and also related to a bit of a conversation we had with Jack Self earlier in the semester, who I think is also interested in, let's say, retooling the typical order of events for architects. So on your chart, it moves from policy to public, but you've flipped that and suggested that maybe the first order of operations is to engage the public and get the public behind. When Jack spoke about this, and he had a kind of different way of imagining that the architect enters into the conversation earlier, but he spoke about the seductive power of the image and the way in which the image is a kind of shared language that we can use to get the public on board. But I suspect you might have a different take on that. I know in a previous lecture you spoke about how when you're given a design assignment, the first thing you do is research and write, and you withhold design, because I think for you writing is a way to think through design. And I think you very beautifully shared with us something that you wrote that was also a way to think through the design of the installation for the gallery. And I think as either a supplement or an alternative for images to communicate with the public, I think storytelling is something that's equally effective. Is that something that you do often to engage a broader audience, tell stories and write, or is it a combination of writing and image making?
I think it's less necessarily maybe purposeful. Well, I'm trying to think whether it's purposeful to engage certain audience or it's just kind of a natural process. I think it's always a reaction to what's on the table. So if you know, project is conducive to writing, it's going to happen, but if it's not, it's also not going to happen. I do believe in the seductive power of the image, and in a way that's what happened with us with the pool, because it kind of got online and then we got all this feedback and people were into it. And in a way, I'm saying that it's still a huge learning experience. It's still something that I look back at and like, damn, design can really do that. It can really allow people to kind of get behind something. And I don't think I've ever seen it happen to that extent before. It certainly hasn't happened to me before that. So that was really amazing to see that visceral reaction. I think one has to be careful though with not to seduce oneself with the images too. And I think that's always a tricky thing in architecture. What do you apply these tools for, right? Because architecture is many different things, from conception to actually development to actually construction to so on and so forth. So, you know, in today, for example, when I preferred or when I kind of wanted us to just listen to each other and kind of avoid the visuals, it's also just because of the abundance of images where sometimes you just kind of want to clear your brain. And for me, that always happens by going on a walk in the woods. But I think there is the value behind the image. But the question actually landed somewhere else, and I'm completely derailing right now.
No, it was just the way in which, if you start with the public as opposed to policy, and you understand that you need to have them on board, like what's the role of storytelling and or image making?
That's also one aspect which was true both in the case of the funicular and in the case of the pool, and I think some of the other projects too, is, you know, okay, one of the exciting things to me about architecture, and one of the reasons probably why I'm here in the first place, is because in architecture, or in order to do architecture, you don't depend on the architecture community or industry. You don't need the middleman or anything like it. In other industries, fashion, music, it's a lot harder. Maybe in music you can break out today, but it's still a lot harder, as in you depend on record companies and you depend on the industry. In architecture, you don't. You just need someone to trust you and to respect you and to allow you to do that work. And that's where I see, and I'm saying that because talking to non-architects is something that isn't happening enough, definitely not in schools, but it's 90% of our job. I find so often in what we do, our job is to communicate. You have to communicate things to a client, you have to communicate things to the city or to the officials, you have to communicate things to a contractor. You're communicating to everyone very different things, but all about the same project. And everyone cares about different aspects and about different nuances. So I think the way one is talking about their project is absolutely crucial, whether it's through storytelling or any other means. But I do think it's kind of knowing your audience is important. And sometimes I feel the architecture world can be quite removed or kind of speak its own language in a way and be completely inaccessible, when I think, you know, everyone, like non-architects, they know a lot about architecture because they live in it. They're kind of just being told, because we sometimes use super fancy language, that they don't know architecture, but they do, because they know if it works or not, and they know where the sun, whether the sun makes it through the window or not. And especially now that everyone was on lockdown, everyone has really good understanding of what their space can or cannot do. So I think architecture there in general, from my perspective, there shouldn't, that communication needs to be a lot more fluid, or it's kind of our responsibility to be able to bridge that gap.
Yeah, I think it's especially the case if you're practicing, let's say, beyond the kind of service model where there's certain expectations. I think if you're inventing a slightly different approach, communication is critical, because everyone's kind of contributing to the project, and it's not, again, a mere act of providing a service. We have about 15 more minutes, and there are a few questions, so we can get to those, and then maybe we can come back to Evie to help us close out if you have more to say. But Ewen, I think you were first, so you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, I'll try to get this quick, but I have two questions. The first one is the project about the bridge in your hometown. And you're trying to suspend the social life, and then that reminds me of my thesis I did last semester. It was essentially analyzing the NYC subway platform, where you have a space that's narrow and long enough that's bringing everyone bumping into each other in such a small space. So that makes me think about the social, like urban alienation, and how people are together but they're alone. And then I was at the first starting point trying to, like what you did in your thesis project, design maybe some way to bring them closer, instead of like physically closer, but mentally closer. But then it ended up with I'm using a narrative and drawing perspective drawings, like in a very abstract way to think about, like, ended up a loop, how people they don't want to be together. As a matter of fact, that they hate, like there's something upsetting happening as long as there are other people using the space, and there are consequences that they're making. So this is one thing I want to have a conversation with you, like how do you think, especially like after COVID, when everything get back to normal, and the effect of COVID is definitely not reversible. It definitely, there is something like, if they people come to the space and trying to play and use be more like enjoy the fun of the space, they still probably wouldn't be accepting people that they don't know. They will play within their zone still. How do you think about this?
Well, I mean, I think it's hard to predict, but two quick thoughts. One, when I tend to think of public space, you know, I always think that, so I'm a complete introvert, and I always think that I'm a very weird person and not socially adept in any ways whatsoever. So my favorite, you know, my comfort zone is always in a corner in a room and watching things. But that, what I mean with that, and I always admire people who are at the heart of it and, you know, kind of running the party. But I'm saying that for me, the exciting thing about public space, or the conclusion, is always not to be highly prescriptive. So yes, any project can be about people coming together, but that doesn't mean you also can't be by yourself. Like sometimes, in a way, that's the beauty of New York, right? Like you just take the subway and you get a sense of the spirits of the street and what the atmosphere is and what people wear and what they do and what they think, without having to engage too much, which in LA you can't do. So all of that to say that I always think of public space as something that enables. The other thing too is there's just so much diversity in people, especially in a place like New York, but everywhere. So in a way, I feel it's always dangerous not to become important not to become too prescriptive when it comes to public space. Really, that's what I mean with create an infrastructure, or really just kind of enable people to take over spaces in different ways. Now, with regards to COVID, my take generally is that I think our reflex shouldn't be leaning towards, I hear so much people talking about how do we isolate from each other in the future, and we're gonna forever live isolated. And that's to me a very kind of sad or disappointing take. First of all, I think the outcome of how the pandemic was dealt with and how we ended up reacting to it, these weren't given. There were a lot of failures at leadership level. And for us to kind of change our ways of life and not to learn from this, but to give into mistakes would be hugely problematic. So I think, from my perspective, so I think in a way, we should double down on the things that are of value to us. So if, for example, with housing, like, do we all really need to have, you know, are there ways in which we can rethink housing where you are, you might be living by yourself, but you're part of a community where you are aware of your neighbor, where you know your neighbor's name, and where you can knock on someone's door if you need someone, or if you need to bring them groceries, or so on and so forth. And that applies to many different things. I do think people are thirsty to gather, to gather again, and to kind of be with other people. And I think, if anything, the learning curve for me was the value of these things that you can't have. And it goes anywhere from a tree in front of your window to seeing people, to, honestly, for me, it was, I remember at one point going for a jog in Central Park, and this older lady, I can't remember exactly what she said, but she said something to me, and we started having a brief conversation. And I realized at the time what I missed most was strangers and the serendipity that New York enables. So in a way, the way I look at the situation is that we should take these things that we're missing, these things that we took for granted and are of value to us, and double down on them. If we choose to isolate, we're just kind of, I think, making a wrong choice.
I hope the second question will be quick. I really like the idea of how we can, for the career path, we can also choose to do collaborative architecture instead of, you know, just jumping new buildings in the world. So how did you start, or how would you recommend for a graduate student to start with this path of collaborating with others?
Mm-hmm. I mean, you just gotta do it. I don't know if there's a better way. I think for me it was finding, initially, probably the first proper collaboration was with Dawn, where we worked together in an office, and our bosses recognized us in a good team, and then just kind of started placing us together. But it's something that developed over time, and was unexpected, but it was also a learning curve, because the educational system that I was coming on from was a place in which you wouldn't have conversations around projects, or where people, basically, I think maybe it's common in as you're learning, because there's so much insecurity, to actually, you know, take criticism personally. But as I started working in offices, I was lucky that all the offices that I ended up working in, you would put a project on the table, and then you'd have a conversation around the project. And we all had the same interest to make the project the best. So if you could critique it easier, easily, then means it wasn't good enough. So you all had the common interest. So that meant you had to put ego aside and really just be able to embrace productive criticism. And really that mindset, along with a few other kind of similar mind shifts, not making it about ego, leaving the ego out of the way, embracing someone else's way of thinking, all those things that feel deeply uncomfortable and make you very nervous. To me, those are key ingredients for collaborations. But it also took me a long time to get to be at ease with that. And I think part of it was just kind of being more comfortable in my own role and in my own skin before I was able to kind of, you know, properly embrace some of those forms.
Okay.
Will, why don't you go ahead and ask your question, Will, and then if any of you in the chat room would like to ask your question, you can use the raise your hand function, and if not, I'll ask it for you. So Will, go ahead.
Perfect. So generally, and this is a bit of a loaded question, but what do you think the role of plagiarism is in architectural design, particularly because you have, I think, a discipline that fetishizes the new more than almost any other? But then you also have the realization, or like the Borges quote, of, you know, all newness or all originality being oblivion. So what do you think the role of, I guess, intentional plagiarism, I'd say, like kind of Goldsmith or Shirt-esque plagiarism is?
I mean, I don't know about fetishizing newness per se, because it's something that I ask myself. But for example, if you look at something like the funicular, the proposals are literally anything that you see there, whether it's a slide or a swing or a handrail, none of it is unseen or unheard of. They're actually fairly common elements. It's the project itself that put it there. But it's something that I sometimes think about. I have actually no problem with plagiarism, and to me in itself, it's not that exciting unless you make something of it. But from my perspective, I'm not too protective over my ideas. So that's why I put things on the table that are experiments that are on my mind. I kind of can't be bothered to kind of keep things or be afraid that someone takes it. If someone really wants to take it, take it. Partially because I think I can do it better. But partially because also, this is going to sound terrible. No, but because it's your own way of doing things, you know what I mean? So I think one can take a superficial idea and yes, one can make 100 plus balls. Good luck. But in a way, I find this whole notion of let's all keep, like, you know, the way the music industry is right now, that everyone is suing each other over every kind of 5 notes that you're using from song. That's a really sad state of affairs. And I'm not saying people should just be able to steal. I just wish we would be able to live in a world when one income wouldn't depend on it. And where one could just let ideas be ideas, let them float. And you know, especially when it comes to architecture, I mean, how much can you reinvent the wheel? The constraints of architecture, of built architecture, are extremely limiting. And a window is a window, a door is a door, and we can argue about that and so on and so forth. But you're working within similar parameters. And to stop yourself from pursuing an idea because at one time it looks like another one or it smells like one, to me, that's a non-issue. And I think it has more to do with, it's just not an issue in a way, because ideas and one can push them in different directions and in a way, why not? Like, it shows ultimately in the realization of an idea where one's strength or originality for that matter lies. So in a way, I see people more as a kind of team type of like, yeah, let's build on top of each other, rather than, I don't know, each on their own.
Oana, we have 6 minutes and 3 questions. You got this?
Let's go to Reggie next.
You can cut me off.
No. I just want to make sure we address all the questions here. So what's your favorite project you have designed and why?
That's a tough one. I mean, it's sad if you don't like one, right? I'm gonna go right now with, well, probably the lungs, actually, for that matter, although it's not designed per se, like built per se. Either that or I'd go for PS1 just because I can't do that because then I think of the house and so on and so forth. They're there. You're supposed to love them equally.
Reggie, I see you there. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Oana. This is Reggie Black. How you doing?
Hey.
Hey, how's it going? So I have a question. Considering your work has expanded across so many different mediums, like what's an arena or area of creativity that you haven't explored but would love to?
That's a very good one, actually. I mean, I'd love any. There's probably no area where that would be on the table where I'm like, no. I mean, if you would have thought, I would have never said, for example, justice system, but now to be able to work on that, I mean, it's amazing and it's humbling, definitely very humbling. And it's not necessarily a creative area for that matter. But I don't think there's any subject that I would find not interesting ultimately. I think you're able to look at everything, right? Like to find something interesting in every aspect. I think I'm just always excited to learn new things. And in a way, the more foreign the other language is to me, the more I learn about my own limitations and my own rut in a way. So, but it's a very good question.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for joining. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
So we have one more, and then that'll perfectly time us when our captioner has to leave. So we'll take the last question now from Leslie. Evie, did you want to?
Sure. I don't see Leslie. So Leslie asks, how have you personally incorporated fun in your daily practice? That's a nice one to end on.
I mean, you know, the thing with time, you kind of just realize the things that I mean, it sounds cheesy, but that bring you joy. It just really has to do with that. I'm thinking of things in extremely dumb and simple terms. And it's literally, okay, we have very limited time, not just right now, but in general in this place. So how do you want to spend it? And really that's as in a way, it's the same question I've been asking myself since probably high school. And it's something that I kind of keep asking myself, and it comes down to that, just like, how do you want to spend your day? And that has to do that there's so many sides to it, but it's I don't know if I'm answering the question right or not. But it is about making sure that most of your day brings you joy one way or another. And joy is maybe a strange thing, but maybe it's a strange term, but maybe it has to do more some sort of contentment or satisfaction, even if it's hard and painful work for that matter. Some reward in some form, one form or another. Joy is elusive, 2020.
Perfect. That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Oana. You'll also be joining us tomorrow in my seminar, so thank you in advance for that. But really appreciate sharing the work, sharing your personal approach and your stories. We really appreciate it. So thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. Have a good night.
Thank you so much for your time. Have a good one.
Thanks, Oana.
Are you staying? Am I staying?
You don't have to stay because we'll see you tomorrow, but I always like to just see who's still here. I'm going to stop the recording.